The marble beneath Marcus Chen's knees had grown cold during his 3-hour vigil in the abandoned royal bathing chamber of Zephyr Prime. Ancient alien hieroglyphs spiraled across the walls in patterns that seemed to shift when observed peripherally, their meaning locked behind millennia of silence. The discovery that would reshape humanity's understanding of both alien civilization and human potential lay submerged beneath 3 feet of crystalline water that had somehow maintained its clarity for over 10,000 years. Marcus had arrived on Zephyr Prime as part of the standard archaeological survey team, carrying the weight of a failed career and a reputation tarnished by his controversial theories about human consciousness. His colleagues dismissed him as a dreamer, a scientist who had let imagination eclipse empirical method. The posting to this remote world, orbiting a dying star in the outer rim, was meant to be his professional exile, a final chance to redeem himself or fade into obscurity. The royal palace complex sprawled across several square kilometers of what had once been the planet's capital city. The Zephyrians had vanished without explanation, leaving behind only their impossible architecture and tantalizing hints of a civilization that had achieved something beyond mere technological advancement. Every expedition that had studied the ruins reported the same phenomenon, a persistent sense that the answers lay just beyond reach, hidden in plain sight. The bathing chamber occupied the palace's heart, accessible only through a labyrinth of corridors that seemed designed to test the worthiness of those who sought entry. Marcus had spent weeks mapping the approach, noting how each passage presented moral and intellectual challenges encoded in the very architecture. Doorways that only opened when approached with humility. Corridors that led nowhere unless traversed with genuine curiosity rather than mere ambition. The palace itself appeared to be a sophisticated psychological filter, gradually winnowing away those driven by conquest or personal glory. When Marcus finally stood before the chamber's entrance, he understood why previous expeditions had failed to penetrate its secrets. The doorway responded not to physical force or technological intervention, but to something far more subtle, the quality of intention carried by the seeker. Only when Marcus approached in a state of genuine surrender, having abandoned all hope of personal vindication, did the massive stone panels slide silently aside. The chamber beyond defied every expectation. Where his instruments detected primitive stone and mineral deposits, his eyes beheld a space that seemed to exist partially outside normal dimensional constraints. The ceiling vanished into shadows that suggested infinite height, while the walls curved in geometries that shouldn't have been possible within the palace's measured boundaries. At the chamber's center lay the bath itself, a perfect oval of stone that contained water of impossible clarity and depth. Marcus knelt beside the pool, his scientific training warring with intuition that insisted conventional analysis would reveal nothing significant. His preliminary scan showed only ordinary water, unremarkable minerals, and construction materials consistent with the rest of the palace. Yet something profound dwelt within or beneath the placid surface, creating harmonics that registered in his consciousness rather than his instruments. The first revelation came as Marcus stared into the water's depths. His reflection gazed back, but gradually other faces began to superimpose themselves upon his features. Not alien visages, but human ones, expressions of himself that might have been, could have been, or perhaps were being lived out in parallel streams of possibility. Each face carried different weights of experience, different accumulations of choice and consequence. Some bore the marks of confidence and achievement, others reflected decades of fear and hesitation. As the visions multiplied, Marcus began to understand the water's true nature. This was not merely a bathing facility for alien royalty, but something far more significant, a tool for perceiving and potentially altering the fundamental structure of consciousness itself. The Zephyrians had discovered what humans had only theorized, that individual identity was far more fluid and malleable than generally believed, and that the right conditions could allow direct access to the quantum field of unrealized potentials that surrounded every conscious being. The implications staggered him. If consciousness existed as a spectrum of probable states rather than a fixed point, then personal transformation wasn't limited to gradual psychological change over time. Under specific conditions, it might be possible to access and integrate alternative versions of oneself to literally become someone stronger, wiser, or more capable by merging with parallel expressions of one's own consciousness. Marcus had spent his career studying alien civilizations, but now he realized he had been asking the wrong questions. The mystery wasn't what happened to the Zephyrians, but what they had become. This chamber, and perhaps the entire palace complex, represented the culmination of their psychological and spiritual evolution, a technology for transcending the limitations of fixed identity and accessing the full spectrum of conscious potential. The water began to respond to his growing understanding. Subtle currents appeared on its surface, creating patterns that seemed to mirror the neural networks firing in his brain. As Marcus leaned closer, he felt the boundary between observer and observed beginning to dissolve. The reflection looking back at him was no longer quite his own face, but something that contained his features while transcending their familiar limitations. Without fully deciding to do so, Marcus found himself removing his boots and research gear. The action felt inevitable rather than chosen, as if he were following a script written in the deeper layers of his consciousness. The water proved to be precisely body temperature despite having no apparent heating source, and, as he lowered himself into the pool, he experienced an immediate sense of homecoming that defied rational explanation. Submersion brought transformation. The water seemed to penetrate not just his physical form but the very structure of his thoughts and memories. Marcus felt himself expanding beyond the boundaries of his familiar identity, accessing layers of self that had remained dormant throughout his life. The weak, uncertain scientist who had arrived on Zephyr Prime as a professional exile was being systematically dismantled and rebuilt from the foundation upward. The process was neither pleasant nor painful in any conventional sense. Instead, it carried the quality of absolute necessity, like surgery performed by a master physician on a patient desperate enough to accept any cure. Marcus experienced his own psychological architecture being deconstructed with ruthless efficiency. Every fear, every self-limiting belief, every habitual pattern of thought that had constrained his potential was identified and methodically dissolved. In the space left behind, something new began to emerge. Not a different person, but the same consciousness freed from the accumulated debris of small choices, social conditioning, and defensive strategies that had slowly buried his authentic self beneath layers of compromise. The man rising from the water would be recognizably Marcus Chen, but Marcus Chen as he might have been if he had never learned to doubt his own insights or defer to the limitations imposed by others. The transformation extended beyond mere personal development. As Marcus integrated these changes, he began to perceive the true scope of the Zephyrian achievement. They had not simply discovered a method for individual transformation, but had used it to evolve their entire civilization beyond the need for physical existence as humans understood it. The empty cities and abandoned technology were not evidence of extinction, but of graduation, a species-wide metamorphosis that had allowed them to transcend the constraints of matter and energy. The royal bath was their gift to whatever species might follow in their footsteps, a tool for breaking through the psychological barriers that kept conscious beings trapped in cycles of limitation and conflict. But accessing its power required exactly the quality that made its use beneficial, the willingness to release attachment to one's current identity and embrace radical transformation. As Marcus emerged from the water, he carried with him not just personal renewal but a profound understanding of humanity's potential destiny. The weak, fearful aspects of his personality had not been destroyed but integrated and transformed into sources of strength and wisdom. His former tendency toward self-doubt had become enhanced discernment, his sensitivity to criticism had evolved into profound empathy, his isolation had transformed into the capacity for deep solitude and reflection. The implications for human civilization were staggering. If individuals could access and integrate their highest potentials through the principles demonstrated by the royal bath, then humanity might follow the Zephyrian path toward collective transcendence. Wars, poverty, and the countless forms of suffering that emerged from fear and limitation could become obsolete as humans learned to identify with their expanded rather than contracted selves. But Marcus also understood the dangerous nature of this knowledge. In the wrong hands, the power to transform consciousness could become a tool for manipulation and control rather than liberation. The Zephyrians had built their palace as a filter precisely because such power required corresponding wisdom and ethical development to use responsibly. The next phase of Marcus's mission became clear as he stood dripping in the chamber, feeling the residual energy of transformation still coursing through his cells. He would need to document his discoveries carefully, but, more importantly, he would need to find a way to share them that honored the Zephyrian safeguards. Not everyone was ready for direct exposure to consciousness-altering technology, but everyone deserved the opportunity to begin the psychological preparation that might eventually make them suitable candidates. Marcus spent the following weeks in intensive study, using his transformed consciousness to perceive layers of meaning in the palace that had been invisible to his previous state of awareness. Every wall, every corridor, every architectural detail encoded aspects of the Zephyrian understanding of consciousness and its potential for evolution. The entire complex was essentially a textbook written in stone and space, designed to gradually educate worthy students in the principles of psychological transformation. The hieroglyphs that had seemed randomly decorative to earlier expeditions revealed themselves as sophisticated psychological exercises. Each symbol sequence, when contemplated in the proper state of consciousness, would trigger specific insights about the nature of identity, choice, and human potential. The Zephyrians had created a complete curriculum for consciousness evolution, embedded in their physical environment so that it could survive the collapse of civilizations and the passage of millennia. Marcus began to formulate his report, knowing that it would fundamentally challenge every assumption about human nature and potential that formed the foundation of current civilization. The evidence was undeniable: consciousness was far more malleable than generally believed, and humans possessed latent capabilities that exceeded their wildest fantasies. But accessing these capabilities required a willingness to abandon the familiar limitations that most people mistook for their essential identity. The title of his report came to him as he sat in meditation within the chamber, drawing insights from the transformed state of consciousness that had become his new baseline: the Zephyrian Protocols, a manual for human consciousness evolution. It would include detailed documentation of his discoveries, but, more importantly, it would provide a framework for gradually preparing individuals to handle expanded states of awareness without losing their psychological stability. The first protocol involved the systematic identification and release of self-limiting beliefs. Most humans carried thousands of unconscious assumptions about what they could and couldn't do, what was and wasn't possible, what they deserved and didn't deserve. These beliefs operated like invisible chains, constraining potential and ensuring that most people never attempted to access their deeper capabilities. The Zephyrian method involved bringing these limitations into conscious awareness where they could be examined and discarded. The second protocol addressed the integration of rejected aspects of personality. Every individual contained multitudes, potential expressions of self that had been suppressed through social conditioning, trauma, or simple lack of encouragement. The royal bath had shown Marcus that these unexpressed potentials didn't disappear but remained dormant within the unconscious, waiting for the right conditions to emerge and contribute to a more complete and capable identity. The third protocol dealt with the expansion of identity beyond individual boundaries. The highest stages of consciousness evolution involved recognizing the artificial nature of the barriers between self and other, individual and collective, human and universe. This didn't mean losing personal identity but rather discovering that personal identity was much vaster and more inclusive than generally imagined. As Marcus documented these insights, he became aware that his transformation was ongoing rather than complete. Each day brought new capacities and deeper understanding as his consciousness continued to integrate the changes initiated in the royal bath. He found himself effortlessly solving complex problems that had previously seemed impossible, perceiving solutions that emerged from a level of awareness far beyond his former intellectual capabilities. His relationship with fear had been fundamentally altered. Where he had once approached challenges with anxiety and self-doubt, he now felt a profound trust in his capacity to handle whatever circumstances might arise. This wasn't mere confidence but something deeper: a recognition that his essential self was indestructible regardless of external circumstances. The weak aspects of his personality had been transformed rather than eliminated, becoming sources of strength and wisdom. The implications extended far beyond personal development. Marcus began to envision human civilization evolving along the same trajectory as the Zephyrians, not toward technological conquest of the universe, but toward consciousness development that would make such conquest unnecessary. When individuals identified with their expanded rather than contracted selves, competition gave way to collaboration, fear transformed into curiosity, and the endless pursuit of external validation yielded to the satisfaction of authentic self-expression. But such evolution would require careful preparation. The consciousness-altering effects of the royal bath were too powerful to be safely experienced by unprepared individuals. Mental breakdown, spiritual inflation, and the loss of grounded functionality were all potential risks for those who attempted transformation without adequate psychological foundation. The Zephyrians had designed their palace as a gradual initiation process precisely because consciousness evolution couldn't be rushed without dangerous consequences. Marcus's final weeks on Zephyr Prime were spent creating a comprehensive protocol for human consciousness development that honored both the transformative potential and the inherent dangers of the Zephyrian methods. His recommendations included establishing training centers where individuals could gradually prepare for expanded states of awareness, developing screening procedures to identify suitable candidates, and creating support systems for those undergoing consciousness transformation. The most crucial insight involved understanding that true strength came not from eliminating weaknesses but from integrating them consciously. The man who destroyed his weak self in the sense of rejecting, suppressing, or denying vulnerable aspects of personality would remain vulnerable to those very aspects in unconscious forms. But the man who transformed his weak self through conscious integration would indeed become indestructible in the deepest sense, not because he was invulnerable to external challenges, but because his identity was no longer dependent on avoiding or controlling them. As Marcus prepared to leave Zephyr Prime, he performed one final ceremony in the royal bath. Not for further personal transformation, but as a gesture of gratitude to the Zephyrians who had left such an extraordinary gift for future generations to discover. The water responded to his intention by briefly becoming luminous, as if acknowledging his understanding and blessing his mission to share these insights with humanity. The return journey to Earth would take several months, providing Marcus with time to refine his documentation and prepare for the inevitable skepticism his discoveries would encounter. He carried with him not just written reports but a living demonstration of human potential, his own transformed consciousness serving as proof that the limitations most people accepted as permanent were actually choices that could be transcended through proper understanding and application. The man who had departed Earth as a failed scientist carrying the weight of professional disgrace would return as something unprecedented, a human being who had consciously accessed and integrated the full spectrum of his psychological potential. His colleagues would undoubtedly struggle to categorize what he had become, but the evidence of his transformation would be undeniable. Marcus understood that his real work was just beginning. Documenting the Zephyrian discoveries was only the first step in a process that might ultimately lead to the conscious evolution of human civilization itself. The royal bath had shown him that humanity stood at a threshold not just of technological advancement, but of fundamental psychological development that could render war, poverty, and suffering obsolete through the systematic cultivation of human potential. The secret discovered in the alien bath was ultimately not an alien secret at all, but a human one, the recognition that consciousness itself was humanity's greatest unexplored frontier, and that the tools for mapping and developing that frontier had been waiting patiently for thousands of years for a species mature enough to use them wisely. As his ship entered the final phase of its journey toward Earth, Marcus felt the weight of responsibility that came with such knowledge. He carried in his consciousness the seeds of a transformation that could elevate human civilization beyond its current limitations, but only if those seeds were planted in properly prepared ground and tended with wisdom, patience, and respect for the profound forces involved in consciousness evolution. The forbidden alien secret had become a human destiny, waiting only for the courage to embrace it and the wisdom to apply it responsibly. In transforming his own weak self into an integrated and expanded identity, Marcus had discovered not just personal strength but a pathway that could lead all of humanity toward its highest potential. The man who destroys his weak self through conscious transformation could indeed never be destroyed by others, not because he was invulnerable, but because his identity was no longer dependent on external circumstances for its foundation. The royal bath of Zephyr Prime had revealed the ultimate secret, that human beings were not fixed entities struggling against unchangeable limitations, but fluid expressions of consciousness capable of assuming any form their understanding and intention could support. The weak self that most people took to be their permanent identity was actually just one possible configuration of awareness, one that could be consciously evolved into something far more capable, wise, and powerful. As Earth grew larger in his ship's viewports, Marcus prepared to begin the most important work of his life, not the study of ancient alien civilizations, but the cultivation of humanity's next evolutionary leap toward conscious transcendence of its self-imposed limitations. The secret discovered in the royal bath would soon become humanity's invitation to join the Zephyrians in the realm of consciousness that lay beyond the boundaries of physical existence. The transformation that had begun in the crystalline waters of an alien world would continue in the minds and hearts of human beings ready to abandon their weak selves and embrace the magnificent potential that had always been their birthright. The man who had entered the royal bath as Marcus Chen, the failed scientist, would return to Earth as a herald of humanity's next great adventure, the conscious evolution of human consciousness itself. In the end, the alien secret was no secret at all, but a mirror reflecting humanity's own deepest potential back to them across the vast reaches of space and time. The Zephyrians had not vanished, they had graduated, leaving behind a graduation gift for any species wise enough to use it. Now it was humanity's turn to discover whether they possessed the courage and wisdom necessary to follow in the footsteps of their cosmic predecessors. The royal bath awaited future pilgrims, its crystalline waters holding the same transformative potential that had shaped Marcus's destiny. But the real transformation would take place not in alien chambers on distant worlds, but in the consciousness of human beings willing to release their attachment to limitation and embrace the magnificent reality of their unlimited potential. The document that would reshape human understanding lay complete in Marcus's files, but the true revolution would unfold in the minds and hearts of individuals courageous enough to destroy their weak selves and discover the indestructible strength that emerged from conscious integration of all aspects of human potential. The secret was out, now it remained only to see whether humanity was ready to claim its inheritance.